Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak, and I'm in my workshop right now getting ready to make some super accurate surveys of a couple of our most popular sea kayak designs. And I feel like as long as I've got all this stuff set up right now, might as well just make a really quick informal video showing you how I do this, kind of bring you behind the scenes into our design process. And then for those of you who might be interested in doing this in the future, you can use these same techniques. Now, before I show you how to do this, keep in mind, I want you to only use this for the forces of good, not the forces of evil. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that if you have a boat that you have permission to survey or permission to copy, those might be good uses of this knowledge. On the other hand, if you're doing espionage and trying to steal somebody else's kayak designs, even though there's no law against that, I would consider that kind of not cool, and I would hope that you wouldn't use this technique to do that. The other thing I worry a little bit about is historical research, because even though it doesn't happen very often, there have been incidents where unqualified individuals have approached museum officials trying to get access to artifacts, and that has created issues with access for people who are actually qualified to do that kind of historical research. But if you just have a cool boat sitting around, you want to get good lines off it so you can draw it up, maybe produce it in a different medium, this is how to do that. So, starting out here, you can see I've got a super long flat work surface, and believe it or not, these are actually just the workbenches that I use all the time. And every 3 or 4 years, they start to wear out, and so I will make new ones. But when I make new ones, they are extremely flat and extremely clean, which is a great time to take surveys. So what you're looking at here is the flattest sheet of birch plywood that I could find, cut in half to make two 8-foot by 2-foot wide, 3/4 inch thick pieces. And then below these, you can see I've got a couple 2x4s that these are screwed onto. These were the straightest 2x4s that I could possibly find. And those sitting on sawhorses tends to give me a really flat work surface. Now, to level these benches to each other, what I do is I will start with a block sitting on top of the bench like this. This is about 1 inch thick. And then I have another block all the way at the other end, and I've stretched a string extremely tight between them. And then I have another block right here, which is also 1 inch thick. And all I have to do to check that these tables are perfectly lined up with each other is slide this block along this string. And if the corner of this block stays perfectly parallel with this string, that means that this table is perfectly in plane. And if it doesn't, I can always add shims to my sawhorses like you can see right here, so I can get everything nice and straight. And then of course, you do want to make sure that the table is level all the way down the line. So once I've got a perfectly flat, long work surface to work on, I like to stretch a tape measure straight down the center right here. And you can see I've got the kayak itself up on some blocks. These blocks are about 7 inches tall. So this work surface is about 36 inches tall. The blocks are about 7 inches tall. And the reason I like that is if I take my calipers here, I can take measurements like this up to the keel. I can take measurements like this up to the stringer. And then I can also take measurements across the deck as well. And speaking of the deck, you might notice that I've got these little pieces of blue tape on the gunnel on either side, and then another couple pieces of blue tape at the stringer location down here. And these are just basically marking the stations along the length of the boat where I'm going to be measuring. And the reason I like to physically mark these is because, one, sometimes you screw up and you bump your boat or even knock it on the floor. And if you've already taken your heights at that point, you don't actually need to set the boat back up to take the widths. You can just set it down on top of the bench and you can take the widths. Also, for taking the widths of the chines, it's actually easier to flip the boat over. So that's why I like to mark these out. Another thing you want to do when you're setting up the deck is just to make sure that you level the boat. And if you've got a nice flat back deck like I do right here, this is the perfect place to do it because the boat is at its widest. But if you've got a peaked back deck, you're probably going to have to make some little blocks of the same size that come up, and then you can put your level on top of that. And so it's just a nice working height to not struggle or fumble with anything. And that's the most important thing that I want to say about this whole setup. The reason that I take the accuracy so seriously with surveys is that just the process of surveying and reproducing boats inevitably creates errors, because we're going to survey this full size and then we're going to draw it up at a smaller size, and then somebody in the future might want to make it again to a bigger size. And just the line width from drawing and redrawing things, even if you're just working from the same table of offsets, things can start to creep as far as the actual measurements. And so the best way to fight that is to start with the most accurate possible survey that you could take. So just to give you an idea of how this works, first, let's take a look at this sheet that I made. And you can see that I've got the heights right here. This is the height of the deck, the height of the gunnels, the height of the chine, and the height of the keel. This is a pretty simple boat, so it doesn't have very many heights. And then we've also got half breadths here, which are the widths of the kayak. So this is the widths of the deck stringer, the widths of the gunnel, the widths of the chine. Looks like I need to redo this sheet because there should be the keel down there as well, but you get the idea. And then these numbers here are the stations. And these stations are a little bit weird because I have a special plan for this particular survey. But personally, I like to survey at roughly 18-inch increments down the boat. I feel like that helps me capture the shape without having too many stations. If you want to get even more accurate, you could go 12 inches. And if you've got a boat that's really complex with lots of complicated details going on and sudden curves, sometimes you might even want to tighten that to 6 inches or 3 inches to really capture the curve of a certain area. So the stations that you make longitudinally just depends on the purpose and how much accuracy you're trying to achieve. So let's go ahead and measure one of these stations so you guys can see how this works. Now, normally you're going to want to start from the end of the boat, but there's not much to measure at the end of the boat. So why don't we come back to station number 2 right here, which is at 36 inches. And when I'm actually marking out these stations with the tape, the way that I do this is, you can see I've got a T-square that is referenced against the edge of the table, and then I can read the location of the T-square longitudinally on this tape measure that goes down the center. And then to project that height up vertically, you can see that I've got this speed square with a little extension on it so it can reach up a little bit higher. So for example, if I was marking out a station location, I would push the T-square along the edge of the table until the T-square got to my station location. In this case, that's 36 inches, and that's pushing this speed square. And so now I know this line is projected perfectly vertically to this point, and I can put a little piece of tape there. And I always put it so the point of the tape is pointing to exactly where I want to measure. And then if I slide this back like this, I can project that line to where I want to measure on the chine as well, and I can mark that as well. So anyways, I'm going to go ahead and set this out of the way. Also, I find that it's nice to put a little clamp right here just so this doesn't move. Now I can grab my tape measure, and I'm going to measure up to the gunnel height. Gunnel height in this case is 18 inches. So we're going to come down to our table of offsets right here. I'm going to start at the gunnel height, and there's 2 ways to record this information. You can start with just the regular inch measurement, so 18 inches high, or you can use the traditional notation for offsets, which is going to be feet, inches, and eighths. So in this case, 1 foot, 6 inches, and 0.8 of an inch. So that's how offsets are traditionally marked. And I like to do both because if there's an error later on, I'll be able to find it because there will be a discrepancy between one of these 2 numbers, and hopefully I can figure out which one it is. So that's the height of the gunnel. Now we can come over here, measure up to the height of the stringer. 13 inches. Oh, I love that. I love even numbers. So 13 inches for the height of the stringer. So that's going to be 13 inches, or 1 foot, 1 inch, and 0.8. And put little dashes between those. Okay, now we're going to measure up to the keel. Okay, so I'm getting 9, hang on, I'm getting 9 9/16 to the very bottom of the rub strip. And so the rub strip's 3/16 of an inch thick, so that's actually 9 3/4. So I'm gonna mark this down as 9 3/4 inches high. And then the way we would mark that in traditional measurements would be 0 feet, 9 inches, and 6/8. So for this location, these are all of the heights. There's no deck height here because the top of the gunnels is the top of the deck at this location on this particular kayak. But if you had something a little bit higher, like a deck ridge or something like that, it's a little bit tricky to get this number. What you would have to do is get your calipers like this, come to that same spot that you just measured on the keel, and wrap the calipers around until you get to whatever it is you're trying to measure on the deck. And then you can take that off and you can bring it up to a scale. I just happen to have one right here because I have this T-square. And you can measure that number, and you're gonna add that number to the keel height. And that's how you're gonna get your deck height for heights of the deck that you can't normally measure because you can't run a tape measure through the middle of the finished boat. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, just a quick side note here. If you're curious about how these calipers are made, basically I cut these out of a piece of 1/4 inch birch ply. That way they're nice and stiff, even though they're a little bit thin. And it's just 2 long curved pieces of wood, exactly the same as one another. And then there's a pivot point at the corner here. That's a little 3/16 of an inch bolt, and I've got a wing nut on it. And that just allows me to tighten this up. That way my calipers can be exactly the stiffness that I want when I'm taking those measurements. Also, if you're wondering exactly the size of these, let's just measure them real quick. It looks like from one end to the other is 18 inches. And then from the edge of the table to the top of the curve is 6 inches. And from the edge of the table to the bottom of the curve is 5 inches. And so you would just lay this out with a couple battens. You could cut it on your jigsaw or bandsaw, and then you could take this half, put it on top of another piece, and then cut it out so they're perfectly identical. And once again, these are really good for taking outside measurements, but you can also slide them past each other. And I've found that this particular geometry works good for every kayak that I've ever surveyed. So moving on to the breadths here. The breadths are basically the width of the boat, and these are normally expressed as half breadths, which is half of the width of the boat. But when I'm surveying, I usually just write down the actual width that I measure, and then I come through later, cut that number in half, and that's how I create my half breadths. So because I have these pieces of blue tape on here, I know exactly where to take this measurement with my caliper. You want to make sure there's no tension in your caliper. When you pull it off, you don't want it to spring open or close at all. And then you can take it down to your scale. In this case, it looks like 7 1/4 inches is the width of the gunnels. So we're gonna go 7 1/4 inches. And traditionally that would be 0, 7 inches, and 2/8. Now, something I want to point out here is sometimes the measurement ends up being a 1/16 and not an 1/8. And so when there's a 1/16, how we note that with this traditional notation, let's say that this was 7 5/16 of an inch. The way that I would write that is 0.72 plus. So that plus indicates a 1/16 of an inch. Okay. Now the next one we got to measure is the chine location right here. And honestly, I usually don't actually measure the chines like this because I find that it's really hard to be accurate. I'll usually measure my chine breadths at the end when I'm done taking all the other numbers, and I'll just go ahead and turn this thing over and lay it flat on my work table because that way I can just drop the calipers down to that location, and it's a much more accurate way to measure. So just jumping forward to the future real quick, what this actually looks like is you can see I've got the boat upside down right here, and I can just grab my calipers and take them to my measurement point and drop it down. And you can see working from the bottom, there's a lot less chance that these calipers are going to get bumped and you're going to get a much better measurement. However, you can see right away we've got a problem here, because if you come in real close and look at this chine right here, this isn't just one hard edge like you might see in a plywood boat. It's actually two edges with a little facet between them. And if you were just doing something like taking a historical survey, something that really wasn't performance oriented, I would just recommend taking your height and your width right from the middle of the chine, and that's going to be totally fine. But in the case of what I'm doing right here, where I want the survey to be able to reproduce this boat exactly in potentially different mediums so we can have exactly the same performance, I've got to find a way to capture this information. So for this particular boat, what I've done is I've decided to use the top edge of the chine as my reference point. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to take the measurement right here. And then theoretically, you could take a second measurement at the bottom edge of the chine and take a separate set of widths. But I can tell you from personal experience that if you try to do that and you try to draw that up, you're just going to end up with absolutely crazy lines. So instead, what I'm doing for this particular boat is, you can see I've got a smaller speed square here, and I've clamped on a digital angle meter. And to do this, you would have to re-level the boat upside down. But assuming that it's level, you can slide it over to the area you're trying to measure, and then you can just take the angle just like that. And when you're doing this, I would recommend doing it on both sides, adding the numbers together and then dividing them in half. That way you're averaging out any asymmetries in these angles. And then when I go to actually draw this up, in this boat at least, the stringers are a consistent width, which means that I can automatically infer the location of this bottom edge. And also, it's worth pointing out that you can actually use this same technique to capture the angles of the dead rise right here, and also this angle right here as well. So it really just depends on the purpose of the information you're collecting, how you want to take these measurements. You just have to make sure that you are actually capturing the information that you need. Okay, cool. So those are all the basic measurements for this station. And when you're doing this, you're basically just going to walk down the line and you're going to take each of these measurements at whatever station lengths that you predetermined. But there's also a lot more things that you need to focus on here, because you're going to run into stuff like deck lines right here. You want to make sure that you note as much information as you can about every single aspect of the kayak. So I'm going to note how wide this deck line is, how thick it is, what kind of knot it's tied with, the location along the gunnel, whether it's drilled through from the side or whether it's coming in from the top. The more information, the better, as long as you note it clearly so you don't get confused later. You also want to note if there's any rub strips, how thick they are, where they start and where they stop. You also want to note where the chines start and where they stop. And sometimes you'll see the end of the chine through the skin, or in the case of this Greenland boat, the chine just disappears into the plane of the skin, in which case you want to figure out where that starts and then take that location. And then in this blank space down below the table of offsets, I can mark that. Other things you might want to take note of, let's just come back here a little bit. If you've got deck lines with toggles, you want to measure the toggles, the widths of the toggles, the heights of the toggles, how big the holes are. Any information about the toggles is going to be important. If there's a stitching pattern along here, it's worth measuring that. This is all kind of getting into the realm of historical surveys, which is not something I'm encouraging you to do. But let's say your buddy built a skin boat that you want to copy. This is how you take that information. So coming back to towards the cockpit here, you can see there is actually a deck height right here, in which case I would use my calipers and I would just reach around the boat like this to measure this. And then I would add this number to the height of the keel off of the baseline. And that's how I would get the height of the deck right here. If there's a combing, you want to measure the height of the combing, how wide it is, how big the lip is, what it's fastened together with, how it's attached to the skin. Any information that you can gain from the inside of the cockpit is useful. If you've got an open frame that you can survey, that's even better. And it's nice to be able to reach inside here with a tape measure and take some of these measurements and just see how the details were constructed. And, you know, I'm focusing on skin boats right now, but obviously all this information does apply to other types of boats. There's a little bump where the mastic is right here. I would record that as well. So really, it's just a matter of taking your time, being meticulous, being as accurate as possible with your measurements, and recording every relevant measurement, because you can always choose to ignore measurements in the future, but you can't take advantage of measurements that you didn't take in the first place. Now, as far as the purposes of what you might want to do with this information, you're going to end up with a table of offsets with a bunch of notes. And what you can do with that is you can draw that up to make a 2D model. I'm sure you could also model it in a computer program to make a 3D model. And you could use that to potentially make patterns to build these boats in other mediums. So for example, the reason that I'm surveying this Greenland kayak so accurately right now is because I stumbled on gold in my redesign of this boat. This is one of my favorite boats I've ever paddled in my life, and I'm seriously considering having it produced commercially. I'm also considering possibly, don't hold me to this, but having a fuselage frame version for people who are intimidated with the rib bending. And so lots of stuff you can do with this information. It's also just kind of fun to draw up your own survey drawing. It makes a really beautiful art piece on the wall, and it's just kind of a fun boat building exercise to go through. So yeah, I think that's it for now. Hopefully this video was interesting to someone. I just shot this whole thing kind of stream of consciousness on my iPhone because I didn't really want to take the time to make a really serious, like involved video, because I think this is a pretty niche piece of information. So if you like this video, definitely let me know. I'm happy to do more of the off the cuff stuff like this, where I just have Liz hold the iPhone and I just ramble at you for a little while. If it's annoying or the lighting's bad or the sound or something, let me know and we'll just not do that sort of thing. So anyways, I think that's it for now. As usual, if you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're interested in the skin-on-frame kayak that you saw in this video, or really any of our skin-on-frame boats, make sure you check out our website, capefalconkayaks.com, where we have skin-on-frame building video courses, plan sets, and various free skin-on-frame resources. You can also find us on Instagram at CapeFalconBuilds, where we post a daily blog of whatever we're working on in the shop or whatever we're testing out on the water. And you can find that same information on the Cape Falcon Kayak Facebook page as well. So that's it for now. Take care. Be safe on the water. I'll see you next time.